So our event tonight is Building Toward Liberation, Black Lives Matter in the Catholic Church, with Olga Segura. And our event is co-sponsored by the Office of Multicultural Learning and the Graduate Program in Pastoral Ministries. I'm Aaron Willis, the director of the Bannon Forum, here in the Nation Center for Jesuit Education at Santa Clara University. As is our practice, before we start, we pause to acknowledge that Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and Mwekwa Ohlone people. We remember their continued connection to this region and give thanks to them for allowing us to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all Ohlone people of the past and present. Thank you. So the Bannon's Forum's purpose is to hold conversations on the intersection of Jesuit Catholic tradition and mission and contemporary culture and ideas. And when thinking about that role in relation to our university's commitment to be an anti-racist institution, I imagine that on one level that might look like what all kinds of institutions of higher education are doing, whether it be at Stanford or San Jose State. But there's also this question of how that call or commitment is different because we are Jesuit and Catholic. What about that institutional affiliation might call us to live that out in ways that are unique to our context and community? And how do we grapple with the history of the church and its institutions as it relates to slavery, racism, white supremacy, and many other questions? And when I thought about people who are working at the intersection of the Catholic Church and Catholic institutions like Santa Clara and anti-racism, our guest tonight was at the front of my mind. After reading her book and other work, Ms. Segura seemed like the perfect person to help the Santa Clara community think about our own place at the intersection of Jesuit Catholic mission and anti-racist movements like Black Lives Matter. I'm grateful that she agreed to speak to us and join Alison in conversation, and also grateful that she agreed to speak at what is now 9:30 her time, so we could incorporate a number of our friends and partners across campus and at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley. Before I formally introduce Ms. Segura, I just want to mention that as we go through the night, feel free to put questions in the Q&A feature of the webinar. We'll be able to get to those when we kind of get to the conversation piece, but as they come to mind, feel free to enter those into the Q&A feature of the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Olga Segura, who is a freelance writer and author of Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter in the Catholic Church. Previously, she was the opinion and culture editor at the National Catholic Reporter and an associate editor at America Media. She is a co-founder and former co-host of the podcast Jesuitical, and her writing has appeared in The Guardian, Latino Rebels, Shondaland, Sojourners, Refinery 29, and The Revealer. Olga graduated from Fordham University with a Bachelor of Arts in English and a Bachelor of Arts in Italian Language and Literature. She speaks Italian and Spanish fluently and was born in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. So I'd like to welcome and thank Olga for being with us tonight, and I'll hand it over to her.
Thank you so much, Aaron. And thank you and good evening to everyone who is joining me here today via Zoom. And again, thank you to Aaron, to Alison, and everyone at the Nation Center for Jesuit Education at Santa Clara University. I'm so excited to speak today with you all as part of the Bannon Forum's 2022 program. Today, I'm going to be talking about my work and my faith journey and how both are informed by many of the abolitionist organizers and thinkers I have covered for 10 years. And I speak from my Catholic perspective, from my Catholic context, one that was shaped in my homeland of the Dominican Republic. And my work is aimed at helping everyone who encounters it, whether through my reading, through my editing work, through my own writing, from whatever their lived experience might be. My work, I like to think of my work as helping people to think and act on a commitment to helping all persons thrive. And this is a commitment that is grounded in a belief that everyone deserves to have their needs met, that every person is worthy of dignity and flourishing in our society and world. And for me, my Catholic faith demands that this work begin by acknowledging white supremacy and the role Christianity has played in sustaining it. And by acknowledging this relationship and by further understanding how imperialism and colonialism have shaped our world, we can begin to really transform our church, our country, and our world. And this is something that is especially important at this moment in history. We are seeing violence against Black and Brown migrants all across the world. from our US borders to Ukraine, to Yemen, to Palestine. We are seeing violence against our queer and transgender sisters and brothers. We are seeing violence against houseless women, men, and children. We are seeing violence against incarcerated people, violence against refugees and migrants. Our Catholic faith demands that we name these various tragedies and harms and work to eliminate oppressive systems that destroy our world's most marginalized, the very systems that led to many of the crises that we are seeing worldwide. For me, in order to understand how to do this work, and in order to understand the role that my faith can play in this, and in order to maintain the hope and courage to do this work, this begins for me with abolition. And this is a theme that I first began to explore in Birth of a Movement, but it's something that I have sat with even more so since my book's publication. Abolition Feminism Now is a book by Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica R. Miners, and Beth E. Ritchie. And in this book, they write that abolition is both, quote, a mode of analysis and a political practice. They add, abolition feminism has always been a politics, the refusal to co-sign humans and other beings to disposability, inseparable from practice. This means acknowledging and sitting with history, especially the histories of freedom fighting and organizing, the histories and stories that are kept out of our churches, schools, and media. Once we sit with and understand this history, we must then allow it to challenge how we think about our church and faith, and how we imagine, fight for, and build a freer, more authentic, and equitable world. How can one use an abolitionist framework to think more critically about our faith? How can this abolitionist framework as Catholics allow us to hope amid so much collective death? How can this framework challenge us as Catholics, as believers of Christ who are called to respond at this moment in our church and nation's history? I have been sitting with many of these questions as I prepared for our conversation today, and as I prepared for many similar spaces throughout this year. These questions and what it means to think about abolition as Catholics continue to be at the heart of my work and my own commitment to justice, resistance, and liberation. And like many of the people here on the Zoom today, I began to fully sit with these questions after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has killed more than 900,000 Americans, and in New York, my hometown, more than 60,000 people have lost their lives. Thousands have lost health insurance, jobs, savings, and their homes. The pandemic has disproportionately affected Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color, communities which still continue to face violence at the hands of armed police officers. As I was processing these tragedies, while also working on Birth of a Movement, my father got COVID, my partner's father got COVID. Many of our friends lost relatives, jobs, and amid all that, cops were still shooting Black Americans. Violence against transgender women and men was still rising. I began to sit with what it means to exist and survive in a state of constant anxiety. How that anxiety becomes a constant state of surveillance. How that constant state of self-surveillance, already compounded by state violence and surveillance, impacts every part of your life, including your relationship to God. I wrote my first book in that space. I wrote the first draft of a manuscript and sent it off to my publisher sometime in the summer of 2020. By August of that same summer, I rarely left my home, and I worried whenever my partner left our apartment. Slowly, I learned that anxiety was also physical. For months at a time, I couldn't walk without back, shoulder, or chest pain, and I rarely ate without a subsequent wave of nausea. Anxiety was a part of my vocation, my ministry. I wrote my first book in that space, I told myself. So I continued to find new ways to fuel it, new ways to justify it. Those were some of the darkest moments of the pandemic for me. My faith suffered immensely because I could not find hope in the world around me. I finally understood just how cruel the US systems of oppression were, here and worldwide, and I couldn't imagine a better world. Amid so much collective death, I struggled to find hope. I struggled to pray. I struggled to believe. And I didn't really fully emerge from that space until the fall of 2021, when I attended the Black Catholic Theological Symposium. The gathering, which took place at Notre Dame, included Black scholars, theologians, and clergy. And it was in this space where I met Dr. Valerie D. Lewis Mosley, a brilliant pastoral theologian, activist, and professor at Caldwell University in New Jersey. If you aren't familiar with her work, I recommend you go and read her essay, My Unbridled Tongue Challenges Inequities That Threaten Black Women's Lives, which she wrote for the National Catholic Reporter in July of 2020. Excuse me. During my, excuse me, allergy season. During my time at Notre Dame, I listened to Valerie mentor younger activists, including high school and college students. She reminded them of the importance of caring for one's body. She emphasized the need to bring our healthy whole selves to whatever advocacy work we do as Catholics. This was health rooted and loving and caring for oneself. She described the love and hope in Jesus' ministry, the power and love of Christ on the cross, and she challenged me. She helped me to begin to understand that an abolitionist framework, if applied to our daily lives as Catholics, this framework demanded that we imagine and hope for and strive outside of the tragedies around us, and not by further breaking ourselves, but by relying on our communities. Community building, she taught me, was a way to build and create systems outside of the oppressive ones around us, systems outside of the violence of our world. It took me months to fully realize how pivotal that moment was for my own faith life. Valerie inspired me and revitalized my commitment to my own vocation, to my faith, to liberation. I witnessed an intergenerational moment in which she shared her wisdom with someone younger than us both. That reminded me of the power of sharing knowledge, the power of telling stories, the power of being in community, the power of dreaming and building, the power of abolitionist practice in my faith and life. She pointed me back to why I began reporting on the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014, why I wrote the book in 2020, why I write and speak about it today. It was a movement that taught an entire generation how to fight for liberation, grounded in the hope of a better world. It was a movement that taught an entire generation how to imagine, fight for, and build a world that refuses to co-sign humans and other beings to disposability. In 2013, following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi created the Black Lives Matter movement. At the time, it was mostly an online campaign on Twitter and Facebook to help empower organizers, especially younger ones, by providing them with the tools and resources to think about and fight for racial justice. The founders, in the summer of 2014, along with more than 400 organizers from all across the United States, traveled to Ferguson, Missouri. This was shortly after Michael Brown Jr. was killed. These organizers, a majority of whom were men and women in the LGBTQ community, helped to support the marchers who are facing daily violence from law enforcement. Since its birth almost 10 years ago, the movement has grown to include chapters all across the country, providing resources on restorative justice, abolition, conflict resolution. It is a movement centered around inclusion, affirming and centering the experiences of Black, queer, and trans women and men, and working toward a world where all Black people are liberated and free, and by extension, all people. The Black Lives Matter movement taught me how to respond to the world around me. It taught me to pay attention to the most marginalized voices in our nation, how to uplift these voices while also learning from them. By teaching me how to uplift marginalized voices, I began to learn how white supremacy conditions us to erase these experiences, how it disempowers Blackness. I began to understand how patriarchal white power moves within every institution in America, including our church. I was learning about privilege while also coming of age on Twitter. I was existing in spaces where I was accepting my own Blackness while also understanding how this same oppressed body was privileged, how this privilege allows me to move in spaces and with power not afforded to darker skinned women. Through the online hashtag, I was introduced to social critics outside the movement who embodied the tenets of the founders, and who helped me to think more deeply about why and how this movement was born, including thinkers like Zahida Kelly, Zoe Sadmudzi, Dwayne David Paul, and William C. Anderson. These thinkers were, like the founders and organizers of the Black Lives Matter movement, using social media to help their followers to think more deeply about Blackness, abolition, sexuality, colorism, and capitalism. The more I internalized the mission of these women and the organizers around the movement, the more I began to challenge the whiteness of American Catholicism, both internally and externally. In 2014 and 2015, I started attending protests and interviewing activists. I began talking with other Black Catholics, other Catholics of color, about what this movement meant and how it could challenge our church's leadership to commit itself more fully to liberation work. We talked about the role this movement was playing and how we understood and responded to the signs of the times, how this movement challenged our conscientiousness and our relationship to Catholicism. I was born in the Dominican Republic, a Black Catholic country in the Caribbean that shares land with another Black Catholic country. Yet I did not acknowledge my own Black Catholic identity until my mid-20s, when I began reporting on the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014. It took me years to unlearn and begin to truly understand my own Black immigrant Catholic identity, one that was extremely privileged and also oppressed. This movement helped me to begin asking questions internally, while also presenting how these questions and themes were shaping the stories I was writing. BLM and other current social justice movements and organizations like the Sunrise Movement and the Dream Defenders are teaching Americans, especially millennials and younger, how to organize, how to talk about oppression, how to be in solidarity at a time of social distancing and limited in-person contact. Excuse me. It helped me to begin to decolonize my Christianity, to begin to imagine my life outside of the colonialist violence that introduced the faith to my homeland. And most importantly, how to center voices who didn't get a platform in our church and in our media. And all of this conscientiousness altered my faith and my relationship to our church. These movements taught me how to be Catholic, how to be a Catholic writer, how to live out what Pope Francis was preaching. Excuse me. I also came of age during the papacy of Pope Francis. Together with the Black Lives Matter movement, he has challenged me to understand how consumerism under capitalism and systemic oppression are related, how both intersect with white supremacy and vice versa. Pope Francis consistently calls on us to, quote, to get to know people, listen, expand the circle of ideas. Being open to the ways God is moving and calling us to respond to the world around us means that we are, as Francis preaches, to find the courage to leave the confines of our own security and comfort to become bruised, hurting, and dirty as we joyfully approach the suffering other in a spirit of solidarity. For white people committed to authentic, radical anti-racism work, solidarity must include dialogue around power. Who has it, who does not? This means acknowledging and working to relinquish this power. This means recognizing and thinking and talking about white privilege, how white supremacy and racial capitalism have benefited them while simultaneously exploiting and killing communities of color, and how these privileges are present in daily, seemingly mundane interactions. This work will be both internal and external, and it is not easy. But it is absolutely necessary. White allies and all privileged allies, including myself, we must sit with the reality that if you truly care about solidarity, if you truly care about Black lives, about creating a more inclusive church and nation, about faith-based advocacy, then it means asking ourselves, what am I willing to give up to truly center and uplift marginalized women, children, and men? Being concerned with anti-racism work for me as a Black immigrant Catholic means being concerned with anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist work. It means embracing and applying an abolitionist feminist framework to my work. I believe that this means, as Francis teaches us, that instead of centering our own wants, well-being, and needs above those of the community, we have to reject the very systems that created our throwaway society and work to create a world built around a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has remained silent collectively, while individual bishops have opined on this movement. Currently, there is no collective guidance from our leaders on how to engage with Black Lives Matter or any current social justice movement outside of the church, especially those organized by younger people of color. Yet despite the lack of pastoral leadership from the institutional American church, we continue to see Catholics who are showing up to the challenge of working toward justice and liberation. We have seen Black and Brown Catholics doing liberation work in the church since its birth. We know there were Black and Brown Catholics present in Ferguson in 2014. And we know that Catholics of color and many white Catholics protested in a variety of different ways all across the country following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and others killed in recent years. I interviewed Catholics who were present in Missouri in 2014. And I've talked to Catholics who have marched in protest in their respective cities following the murder of Floyd. In recent years, we have seen white Catholics engaging with the movement, and many were actively and consistently raising funds for organizers and mutual aid campaigns, and using their various platforms to urge fellow white Catholics to support people of color being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Many hosted Zoom book clubs and webinars where they discussed many of the topics and themes I've mentioned here tonight. Many listened and learned from women and men of color. All of these efforts are important and they must continue, but they are not enough, and white Catholics, both lay and clergy, must not get complacent. We must continue to confront our history. We must understand how we as a church have been shaped by the very colonialist sentiments that guided the early church and the so-called founders of this country. We must confront how those sentiments connect to the white rage and violence we saw at the Capitol, and how that anger and hate relates to the inability of our church leaders to collectively engage with any movement that is not led by white men. The United States has always encouraged white rage and violence. European colonizers, angered by the treatment they received in their homelands, arrived on Turtle Island and violently stormed and pillaged lands that were not theirs. Colonizers raped and murdered and profited from this violence, selling enslaved African women, men, and children. The creation of new technology at the turn of the 20th century meant more reformed, sanitized systemic violence against citizens of color. Segregation, voting restrictions, redlining, prisons, detention centers. The United States of America has the highest number of incarcerated people, and our inequitable healthcare system has played a role in the deaths of almost 1 million Americans. Such white colonialist violence is how my people became Catholic. This is Catholic history, a part of our faith that cannot be ignored. There can be no reckoning and no path forward for our church until our leaders and all white Catholics begin to repair the harm our church has caused and continues to cause Catholics of color. This means sitting with this history and allowing it to change and better your relationship to your faith, your relationship to your community, to the world around you. I want to challenge white people inside and outside of our church to engage with abolitionist work, including organizers and thinkers who are inviting us to learn from the multiple ways ordinary people try to respond to interpersonal harm, particularly gender and sexual violence, without resorting to police and prisons. This must frame the way white Catholics are thinking about allyship, because it can challenge white people inside and outside of the church to internalize that they have power they can shift to other communities. I want white Catholics to confront their privilege and to think about how they have been complicit in systemic oppression. And I want this to inform how you relate and uplift the pro-life issues that matter to Black, Indigenous, POC communities. Black and Latinx citizens continue to be disproportionately affected by violence, especially during the pandemic. Women of color make up the majority of unemployment rates. Black mothers continue to receive inadequate medical care, from primary care physicians denying our pain to higher maternal mortality rates. Indigenous teens face the highest rates of suicide rates and domestic abuse. Asian American women are most likely to remain unemployed longer than 6 months. And the Asian community continues to be harassed and assaulted by racists all across the country. US Black and Latinx transgender women are 3 times more likely to be killed. Americans of color also face higher rates of anxiety, depression, and are more likely to suffer a heart attack or stroke. I'm sharing these statistics this evening because white people in our church need to hear them and understand that along with the various tragedies threatening our livelihood, we are also suffering anxiety, depression. We are spiritually devastated. We are spiritually suffering. This is violence every single day enacted upon our communities, enacted upon our lives. Despite this violence, I find hope in the resilience and knowledge of Black people, of women like Valerie who continue to spread intergenerational wisdom, who inspire and call us to action. For white allies, resilient hope must include uplifting all of our stories, our pains, and our hopes. But it also means sitting with colonialist history and the church's historic complicity in systemic oppression. In sitting with this history, you must sit with the feelings and questions it raises. It is in this space where resilient hope can be born, where true, authentic liberation work for white allies must be grounded. And to fight for Christ-centered liberation, one founded in love and hope, means that we must fight to free communities like mine from any kind of suffering. For Catholics, this can mean thinking more deeply about the resources and groups created at our respective parish groups, on Catholic campuses, in Catholic book clubs. This means asking what relationships our physical churches, parishes, and religious leaders have to oppressive systems, including local police forces. This means creating and imagining new ways to be Catholic allies, whether it is raising funds to bail out or support organizers after they are arrested, supporting BIPOC organizers with rent or whatever supplies they might need, especially for queer and trans women who do a lot of this liberatory work unpaid. This can also mean imagining and dreaming of a Catholic allyship that has not been dreamed of before. The Black Lives Matter movement helped countless begin to understand what it means to organize. It jump-started the conscientiousness for many in my generation. It helped me to begin to ask questions I had never asked before, of myself and my church. In recent years, we have seen criticisms of the movement emerge, including criticisms from the families of survivors of those killed by armed white violence, and criticisms from Black journalists who have attempted to call out the movement for transparency around how funds allocated to the movement have been used. These are important critiques, especially because they are coming from Black Americans who have followed and engaged with the movement in a variety of different ways. However, the criticism I often hear from white Catholics in our church is not aimed at holding the movement accountable to the community it claims to serve. Rather, the criticism I have often heard from white Catholics is aimed at disparaging a movement authentically centered around Blackness and a rejection of whiteness. From its Black queer founders to the grassroots trans organizers that empowered the movement in Ferguson, to the Black journalists who have reported and analyzed the movement since its birth. This is an important distinction because we cannot lump all of the criticisms of this movement with criticisms that are emerging from white Americans who are grounding the criticisms in very racist ideology. And it's important when we sit with the movement's history to understand the difference in the criticisms that we are seeing. We need to understand the movement and how it has inspired and galvanized thousands, while also learning from the thinkers who are actively forcing the movement to learn new ways of holding itself accountable. We must understand the importance of this movement in the histories of liberation in the United States. This movement helped me to think more deeply about my faith. It helped me to think more deeply about storytelling. It helped me to think more deeply about how to care for the world around me. Through the lens I developed covering this movement and its relationship to Catholicism, I began to also think more deeply about abolition work as part of liberatory Christ-centered work. As Davis, Dent, Miners, and Ritchie wrote in Abolition Feminism Now, quote, "Abolition will not end all harm or interpersonal violence. We must do the work to both prevent and reduce harm, while we practice and grow transformative ways to respond when harm does happen. Abolition feminism is this intentional investment of our resources to support a flourishing of our collective best selves, while reclaiming accountability from the carceral regime," end quote. How can abolition help Catholics to think more deeply about our faith? How can it help us to think more deeply about questions of justice and reconciliation? How can it help us to think more deeply about how to fight for and create a world where all of creation can truly flourish? How can abolition help us to critique not just oppressive systems, but the power and privileges white bodies are allowed to hold in America? How can one use an abolitionist framework to think more critically about our faith? I hope that what you heard from me tonight New York time, I hope that it allows you to sit with these questions. And I encourage you to read, along with Abolition Feminism Now, I encourage you to read Becoming Abolitionists, Police Protests, and the Pursuit of Freedom by Derricka Purnell. I've been reading Purnell's book the last few months. And in this book, she describes her own faith life and her own journey toward abolition. And this book really helped me to ask myself many of the questions and ideas I have presented you all tonight. And it also invited me to more deeply theorize about what it means to fight for a Christ-centered liberation centered around abolition. But it also helped me to think about how to practically apply an abolitionist framework to my daily life, including how I relate to the people in my community. So last, to conclude, as you enter into this work, as you sit with many of the questions and topics that I've raised here tonight, as you research and read many of the thinkers that I have shared with you all tonight, as you enter into a space that I'm calling, for lack of a better word, a sort of discernment centered around liberation, I also invite you to think about the role that art can play in this journey. And that can be art from music that you love, a TV show that you love, a movie that you love, or a book of poetry that you love, however you might define art. I encourage you to use art as sort of supplemental research as you engage with a lot of these really heavy and difficult topics. I encourage you to think about how art can help you think about what it means to imagine our faith outside of whiteness, imagine our faith outside of institutions that harm so many. I invite you to include art that can help you think about these questions more deeply. And the parting words that I want to leave you all with tonight actually come from one of the pieces of art that helped me when I am thinking about these topics, when I'm trying to write about these topics, when I'm trying to just pray about these topics. And a piece of poetry that I like to sit with is from Nayira Waheed's Salt. And in this anthology, or in this book of poetry, she writes, decolonization, excuse me, decolonization requires acknowledging that your needs and desires should never come at the expense of another's life energy. It is being honest that you have been spoiled by a machine that is not feeding you freedom, but feeding you the milk of pain. Thank you all for listening today.
Thank you so much, Olga. One of the terrible things about these webinars is that you're not able to hear and see the appropriate response to what was a challenging, thoughtful, inspiring lecture. So I really appreciate your talk. I really appreciate you being here and everything that you challenged us with, shared with us, and called us to. So Thank you very much for that. And now, just to continue our conversation, to kind of dive deeper into many of these themes, I'm happy to introduce Alison Benders, who is Vice President for the Division of Mission and Ministry at Santa Clara University. Prior to this role, she served for 7 years as the Associate Dean of the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara, where her teaching and writing focused on racial justice and reconciliation. Next month, Liturgical Press will release her book, America's Original Sin, A Pilgrimage of Race and Grace, which is a reflective immersion into our nation's history of racial injustice through a personal and theological lens. She also authored Just Prayer, a book of hours for peacemakers and justice seekers, which won the Catholic Publishers Award for Spirituality several years ago. So thank you again, Olga, and I'll hand the conversation over to Alison.
Great. Aaron, thank you so much. And Olga, thank you so much for your wisdom today. And one of the things I can say to our participants and the people who are here is Olga gave us such a glimpse of the stories, a glimpse of the power of activism, the understanding of abolition. But I encourage you to read her book if you haven't yet, because you'll get the benefit of her incredible ability to tell a story and bring us into it in a really, really powerful and compelling way. So Olga, you've done tremendous work and a tremendous service to help us call us to activism. So one of the things, there are a couple questions I have, and I've some fun questions and some really serious questions. One of the things, maybe I'll start with a serious one first and continue that conversation that you called us to. What I was hearing is, especially as a woman of European descent, European American descent, claiming Catholic, I heard this call to internal work. And I've heard an expression, somebody saying, I've found myself in the story of the US history of race and suffering. I feel that you're calling me and others to that internal work of recognizing, especially with your closing poem, that we feed and we thrive. Our privilege as a person who's white thrives on the suffering of others, and then to look really and study that history. So how did you make the conversion from hearing the history in your heart, in the stories as a reporter, to actually grasping the need for us to do our own exploration? What was that shift? Was there a moment that you saw or heard something and said, oh my gosh, this is a call to me, not just a reporter?
Oh yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for being in conversation with me tonight, Alison, and thank you for your mix of fun and serious questions. And I think this is an important one to really start off with. I think that it kind of happened for me in stages. When I started reporting on the Black Lives Matter movement back in 2014, I really felt, and I couldn't name it at the time, right? Because hindsight is I'm totally projecting a lot of what I've learned in years. I'm naming it with the lens I have now. But I think that shift for me really began in 2014 when I saw this movement, and I was watching this movement emerge online, and I was watching people in my community engage with this movement for the first time. And it was also at a moment where I was really struggling with my place in the church, and I was really struggling with my place in Catholic media. And I thought, okay, the institutional church is talking about Catholicism in a really, really white way, in a really, really white-centered way. And then media is also talking about my faith in a really, really white-centered way. But when I was going home into my communities, we weren't seeing these sort of mainstream ways in which Catholicism was being described. And then here was this movement that really just challenged me to think, wait a minute. So if you are not seeing these stories, then maybe you have to go out and actively tell these stories. And maybe you have to be the one to center these stories, because I started to feel sort of the spirit at work within me when I started doing this work. And I, for years, just learned as much as I could about the movement, talked to people within this movement, and started to think about many of the things that I mentioned here tonight. I began to think about these things for the first time, right? Thinking about abolition, thinking about the presence of police, thinking about how institutions sort of adopt these oppressive systems in very insidious ways. But it wasn't until the pandemic that that shift fully happened. I think I had a very sort of theoretical understanding and a sort of, I had the theoretical understanding of how oppression was manifesting in the US. I had my own lived experience as a Black immigrant living in her community in the Bronx in New York City. But it wasn't until the pandemic where I really saw that shift happen, where I said, oh my God, there are so many people dying around me. There are so many people dying all around the country, all around the world. And this isn't what was supposed to happen in this idea of the United States that I had grown up to understand in the US educational system. This wasn't the America that I learned about in school, right? And I think that final shift really happened in June of 2020, like it happened for so many people, right? We saw in real time how these systems that were set up in this country were not keeping our communities safe. We saw how these systems were not giving us resources at a time when we really needed it. And that was a huge moment, because that was really when it clicked for me. I said, oh my God, okay, this oppression is happening on this large scale. And what am I supposed to be doing, right? Because I think that shift happens, but it's not an easy shift at all, right? You don't wake up and say, okay, I'm aware of how oppression works in this country and now I can continue to exist. No. That shift was and I mentioned this in a little in my talk tonight, that shift was accompanied by a lot of darkness, a lot of, to borrow very Ignatian language, there were months and months of desolation, because I became so aware of this. I became so aware of these systems, and I was seeing them in real time. I was seeing how it was affecting my people, my community, and that was difficult. And the pandemic was really what pushed that to the forefront of my mind and really helped me to fully understand, oh, okay, this is why these movements are emerging, right? Because there will always be inequity under these systems, and there will always be marginalized groups that are suffering. And these social justice groups are attempting to address that in whichever way that they are trying to address it. But that was the moment, the pandemic was the moment for me that shift fully happened, that I felt. I like to talk, the way I like to describe it when I'm talking with my friends and family, it's like, it felt as if this veil had been lifted off of my eyes. And I was kind of like, oh, I'm seeing the world in a new way. And how is my faith going to impact this? How is my faith going to help me? Can my faith help me with that moment? So that was when the shift happened for me. And it was a very dark and desolate time, because it's easy, right? We were all home, we were socially distant, we weren't with our communities, we weren't worshiping together. So that shift happened in isolation. My partner and I were in our home, and that made the shift feel even more jarring, even more sort of traumatic, because it was happening so removed from my communities. But that's when I would say that it fully pushed me into a space where I was like, oh, okay, you've been thinking and reporting about liberation kind of from the outskirts, right? Kind of without, like, people knew what my stance was. I think you can read into what my stance was when I've been reporting on this movement. But I think after that shift in 2020, and you can see, well, not everyone read the early manuscripts of my book, but my editor saw that shift, right? My editor saw when that shift went from, here I am reporting on this as an outsider, to, oh no, I'm someone who is from these marginalized communities and I need to tell their stories. And that's the biggest impact that's the biggest sort of consequence of that conscientiousness that happened for me.
Yeah, really powerful. Thank you for that, for opening your own story, Tess, because that's really vulnerable. So thank you for that. So let me turn to one of the questions that was asked by Chris Harris, and I'm going to click answer live. But one of the things I noticed in your book is you recognize the gap between what the Catholic Church as an institution says and what it does. And Dr. Harris asks, how would you encourage Black and Brown non-Catholics to challenge Catholic institutions, Catholic universities, or Catholics on issues rooted in privilege and racism?
Thank you for that question. I think one of the ways that I would encourage, or not encourage, I think encourage might not be the word here, but I think Black and Brown folks outside of Catholic spaces also have their own understanding of liberation work. And many also come from different types of faith traditions that have, and different faith traditions that have a very specific understanding of liberation work. And a lot of people outside of our church also have their own relationship to advocacy work and their own relationship and understanding of how institutional faith and how institutional Catholicism should exist in the United States. And I think for me, what has always been very, very helpful when I step into spaces with other Black and Brown folks outside of Catholic spaces, I have always learned most from folks who remind a lot of Catholics that it can be very easy to get bogged down in like what's happening within our church, what's happening within our parish groups, what's happening within our Catholic campuses. And I think people outside of those spaces can challenge Catholics to engage with liberatory work that exists outside of the institutional church. Because I think a lot of the histories that I'm calling on Catholics and institutional leaders to do is already being done, right? We've seen a lot of people within this Black Lives Matter movement do a lot of the grassroots work and allyship that I would love to see from our church leaders. And I think when people outside of Catholic spaces, especially Black and Brown folks, when I have been most helped by them is when they ground me in grassroots history and movements that are happening outside of the church. And when I am put into contact with people who are doing a lot of the work that, again, it can be very difficult to see from within like the very specific Catholic spaces in which we're in. And I also just love when people invite me into conversation and scholarship and reading with marginalized folks who are not Catholics, because again, I think that Catholicism in the United States can be very elitist in a lot of ways. And I know that I am very capable of that too. I spend a lot of time being critical of bishops and being critical of the institutional church. And it can be very, that allows it to be it can be very tempting to do that line of thinking and only talk about Catholics. I'm sounding a little bit repetitive, but I hope my point is coming across. I think just like anytime folks outside of the Catholic Church can engage with Catholics and remind them that the world exists outside of the Catholic Church, right? That liberatory work doesn't just have to grow within the Catholic Church. I think that is an important challenge for Catholics, because I think a lot of us need to hear that the work that we're doing doesn't just also have to be big Catholic with a C, right? It can also be something, a lot of the answers that we're looking for can be found in spaces that aren't really Catholic and that aren't religious. So I think when Black and Brown folks outside of the church invite Catholics into those spaces, I think that that is an important challenge, because it can really ground us and humble Catholics in a way that we need to be humbled. So I hope that kind of got a little bit at that.
Good. Thank you. Let me pull up another question or just make a general comment. Someone asked whether we can get a copy of the Zoom meeting, and Aaron, the answers to that is yes, right? By requesting it from you.
Yes, correct. Yeah, we'll make it available for sure.
Great. So this is a question from Chris Stampolis, and Chris asks, or let me paraphrase a little bit, and which is that there is also a white against white hate, sometimes right between progressive whites, perhaps more conservative whites, quote, elite, or blue collar whites or something, but yet their whites don't surveil other whites as they go through stores, or or police officers wouldn't be targets of police officers who stop them, or they're not as at risk of death at the hands of law. So can you talk a little bit about the dynamic, sort of the whole trajectory of racial dynamics and privilege that might include not just a binary or white people of color, but white versus white, and how that privilege may play out?
Yes, of course. So I think a lot of that binary, I just want to acknowledge that, yes, that binary, these binaries can get very, very complicated, and using them can allow us to kind of ignore a lot of the nuance that goes into these specific demographics. But I think I can't necessarily speak to the white versus white dynamic as well as a white person might be able to, but just from what I've observed, the tensions, if I'm understanding the question correctly, sort of the tensions that I see that exist within sort of the white versus white conversations that I have been privy to around racial justice and around like this movement in particular. I think a lot of those conversations can often benefit from being framed around class issues, right? I think that when we think about the impact of class, regardless of your race or ethnicity, right? Like class is a very real factor. We know that the wealth gap in the United States keeps getting bigger and bigger. And when white folks are talking about privilege, especially within white spaces, one of the things that has to be talked about is the role of class there, right? Because when we're talking about privilege and when we're talking about power within white spaces, we also are talking about class, right? We're talking about people who have a lot of power and who have a lot of resources. And then we're talking about people who might not have the same power and resources, but who have the privilege of that white skin and that have the privilege of being able to move through white spaces because of that skin color, because of their proximity to whiteness. And I think when those conversations are happening, it's important to talk about class. And it's important to talk about class without disregarding the fact that whiteness is privileged in very real ways. You know, I even talk about that with myself. I have been able to move in very specific spaces because of the lightness of my skin. And when white folks, white allies, white Catholics are having that conversation, it's important to apply that class lens and to acknowledge the difference in lived experiences depending on what tax bracket you're in, but also acknowledging that white people are still very close to whiteness and that accompanies them everywhere that they go, right? And I think stepping into a conversation where you are acknowledging that, yes, class impacts white folks very differently, but that whiteness is still a role. I think that is how I think about answering that question.
Good, thank you. I want to ask another question that came up from Daryl Grigsby, who notes that Catholic social teaching and liberationist theology, womanist theologians within the Catholic tradition have already given us the theological basis for anti-racist work and abolition work, and yet the church seems to have chosen, a white identity over activism towards abolition. And Daryl's question is it possible for the majority of white Catholics to listen to the voices of Catholic social teaching? What would you say to that? I mean, yeah, we all see that, and we know in the Catholic divide between we're pious Catholics or we're Catholic social teaching. I don't mean to reduce too much.
Yeah, I honestly, I think that's a really, really not kind of loaded question. I think that, yes, I think it is possible for white Catholics, all Catholics trying to be allies, to listen to Catholic social teaching, right? And it's very easy for us to think about Catholic social teaching and to list all of the ways that we're supposed to center, fight for workers' rights, fight for the family, fight for the most marginalized in every aspect of our society. I think it's very easy to admit that on a superficial level, right? It's very easy for us as Catholics to talk about Catholic social teaching, but I think it becomes complicated when we ask the question, when we say, okay, if we are going to center the most marginalized, right? Because that's what our faith tells us to do. That's what Pope Francis has called us to do throughout his papacy. Who are we talking about when we say the most marginalized, right? And I think that that's where I see a lot of the tension that white Catholics and white allies, in particular, white Catholics who are grappling with this question of allyship, that's where I see the tension. I think that it is very, very possible. And it's easy for Catholics to vocalize Catholic social teaching and to name all the themes of Catholic social teaching, but it's much more difficult to, one, name who we're talking about when we're talking about the most marginalized, and two, it's even harder to act once we name who those most marginalized groups are. And I think the holdup for a lot of Catholics become, okay, if we are talking about the most marginalized, right, we're talking about Black women and children. We're talking about Black, queer, and trans women and men, right? And we're talking a lot about groups that have, like you mentioned, Allison, that have been in the adoption of our sort of public persona of Catholicism in the US as white. We have disregarded those. We have disregarded those marginalized groups because in adopting a very white Catholic identity, we have also defined who we see as worthy of being viewed as a victim or who we see as worthy of being a marginalized group. So I think that, yes, it is very, very easy for Catholics to name Catholic social teaching and to even talk about it. It can be easy for a lot of folks to talk about it at a very theological level. But I think when it comes down to practically answering the question of who are we talking about when we say we have to center the most marginalized and how are we fighting for the most marginalized, I think that's when the tension arises for a lot of Catholics. I think that we don't want to name the marginalized groups because they don't look like white folks. And I think that we don't want to think about how to create a church that would actually cater to those marginalized groups, right? Because to create a church that is committed to those marginalized groups means creating a church, Catholic spaces that are completely decentered from whiteness. And imagining Catholic social teaching outside of a white lens is very, very difficult for a lot of white Catholics. So I think, yes, very easy for so many of us to talk about Catholic social teaching, but it's very, very difficult to say, okay, then we need to center Black people. We need to center Indigenous people. We need to center Indigenous children, Indigenous teenagers. We need to center Black queer women. It is very, very difficult when the victims and the marginalized groups aren't in bodies that display whiteness. So I think that, yes, again, Catholic social teaching is easy for us to do, can be easy for us to do as Catholics, but practically we really struggle with that because, again, it requires us to center Blackness in a way that we have never done as a church in the United States.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me ask a fun question. You and I chatted with Aaron before we got started, but I was curious about, you interviewed people in my mind who have taken on sort of legendary status or stature. Who was really fun to interview, or is there a behind the scenes interview story that you can share us? Because your research and investigation is just so impressive. So you must have a good story for us.
Yes, thank you. And I thank you for the shift into these more sort of fun questions. And like you mentioned, Allison, we were talking about how much I enjoy getting able to like talk about the behind the scenes process of my writing. So I don't have a very specific behind the scenes story related to the book in particular, because a lot of these conversations were happening over Zoom in real time during the pandemic. But I think one of the conversations that I was really, really grateful for was, not a conversation, but like one of the interviews that I had was with Rebecca Christian, who is a doula, who is a playwright, Black Catholic. And that conversation for me was, it's not anything out of the ordinary. There's no like super fun behind the scenes anecdote, but it really changed me in a way because as I was writing this book, I envisioned this book in a very specific way. I thought that it was going to be very historical. I'd provide this timeline and then I'd say, okay, white Catholics, here's what you got to do to be better. And then again, that conscientiousness, this shift that sort of happened throughout the pandemic really made me want to dedicate a chapter and dedicate a lot of my future work to just talking to Black women and talking to Black women about their faith, talking to Black women about their stories. And that's one of the chapters in the book. And Rebecca Christian was one of the women that I featured. And learning about the work that she does as a doula, learning about the ways in which she talks about reproductive justice and learning about the ways in which she talks to mothers and the ways that she helps mothers or expectant mothers through some of the darkest moments in their lives, that really challenged me in a way that I did not expect, because it made me think in a different way about motherhood and what role our faith should play. And that happened to me in a time when I didn't expect that to happen. I didn't expect to center this story or to be moved by this story. So I was really, really grateful to just learn about the work that doulas do. That was something that I was not familiar with. And to be able to learn about that from a Black Catholic woman who's also very faithful and who was talking about her work and the impact of her work the impact of her faith in her doula work, that for me was very revitalizing and felt new and refreshing in a way that I did not expect as I was working on that book. And it's just always interesting to learn from people who their work allows them to be around babies and children. I think that that's something, as someone who does not spend time in her writing or editing work around children, it was really, really impactful for me to learn about a new way, a new Black Catholic experience. So that was really, really inspiring for me. And if you want to learn more, follow Rebecca Christian on Twitter. She's also really, really funny. And that was also fun for me as well.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm noticing we're about at an hour. Would you tell us, now that this is out and you're talking to us, and to make sure I have enough time to say it, again, I'm so grateful and so impressed. And I'd mentioned that your work informed some of the work that I was doing last year. So I'm grateful for that. But what's next for you as, what are you following, or where are you finding your voice, or you speak to invite people into activism or identifying their own privilege? What, we're telling the stories and uplifting the voices of women of color, for example. What's next for you?
Thanks, Allison. Thank you for giving me the space to kind of talk about what's next for me. So I think, didn't mean this to be like a sort of natural segue from the previous answer, but a lot of my work, I want to focus now, especially since I'm back to freelancing. I want to spend a lot of time kind of reporting on Black maternal mortality rates and thinking about, how our faith challenges to show up for mothers and Black women at this moment, when the number of Black women dying, giving birth is rising, has risen during the pandemic. So I want a lot of my reporting and work to be centered around that issue, and namely thinking about the role that Catholic spaces can play in supporting Black women in this, especially because I'm also in my 30s thinking about what Black motherhood will look like for me and my partner. So I'm spending a lot of time thinking about how to report on that as a writer. I'm also thinking about how to get involved. I've had a lot of Catholics reach out to me who are doing abolition work throughout the United States, very much at the grassroots level, but who are inviting me into that space. So I think I want to spend a lot of time learning from folks who are abolitionists on their day-to-day on a much more, on a deeper level than I am. So I want to spend a lot more time learning from other Catholics who are engaging with this work. And I'm working on my second book. I'm working on book number 2, and this one in sort of in the same vein of the Black motherhood. It's going to be a book that focuses on this is not the final, but this kind of like the very generic idea that I'm throwing around. It's going to be conversations with Black women, and it's going to be conversations about the intimate worship spaces that we have created in our lives, and what community looks like for us at a time when many of us are not returning to institutional in-person churches. So I'm spending a lot of time community building and figuring out how to do all of that Christ-centered liberatory work that I've been mentioning, figuring out how to do that in New York City, figuring out how to do that in my day-to-day life, because like many people, I can become very overwhelmed and think that the world, everything is insurmountable and everything, it's going to be very difficult to destroy all of these systems of oppression. But I keep telling myself, especially because it is Resurrection Week, right? Easter was on Sunday. And I keep thinking to myself, Jesus wants you to help the person in front of you. Jesus wants you to help the community in front of you. So I'm going to spend a lot of time figuring out what that looks like and finding hope in building and dreaming of new ways to do that with my community.
That's wonderful. So I will say on behalf of myself, and I'm sure I speak for others, you have been a blessing to us. Your work has given me hope and us hope. And we really wish you Godspeed as you continue the work you're doing, and we'll watch for it and take your words and call to heart. So thank you. Thank you. Aaron, do you have some closing words for us?
No formal closing words other than to thank Olga for being here and being with us. So, and yeah, we look forward to what comes next, and hope you can be physically present in Santa Clara at some point in the future as your work continues. and we continue this conversation as well. So just thank you and my gratitude, and thanks to Alison for being a part of the conversation as well. And thank you to our participants. I tried to get a few of the references into the chat so people could link to them. I wasn't perfect, but you can find links there to Olga's work, to some of the work she mentioned, and thank you all for being